Hello, everyone. This is Professor Stanley, Louisiana State University at Alexandria, Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences. We are going to talk today a little bit about the beginning of the book, a couple of chapters in the beginning, chapters 1, 2, and 3, and we will get to that here in a little bit. But first of all, I would like to discuss with you what an application assignment looks like when you turn in your applications to the Moodle course website in the Dropbox area. I wanted to give you all a good idea of the expectations for when you do an application assignment. I know this week we had our first one, and I had also provided you with an example in a previous video lecture. So I just again want to let you see what an application assignment looks like. You have a running head and a page number at the top of each page. You have the title of your paper, and this is one of the older papers that I completed in graduate school in a law and public policy class. Nonetheless, it's a good example. So you have your title, you have your name, you have the course, which you are in Poly 2051, American Government. You have my name, or the professor's name, and this is a template that you can use for other classes as well. Obviously, the information will be different, but the purpose is to get you to understand how APA formatting works in the social sciences, because you are in a social sciences science course, and the American Psychological Association has a standard way of writing within any discipline on the behavioral and social science part of academia. So again, a lot of you may think that I'm trying to bore you to death here, but the goal is to get you familiar and acquainted with a standardized system of writing, just in case some of you may encounter this in other classes or perhaps in graduate school. So again, these are I call them mini papers or mini assignments. When I say 2 to 3 pages, not a whole lot of information you can put in 2 to 3 pages. But you can answer some very basic questions that the book asks and that I ask of you. And you can see that the formatting here allows you to do that. Again, you want to follow basic APA guidelines, double-spaced paragraphs. This information that I have here is, again, just an example of some things that I had pulled from a previous paper that I had written about ethics and administration and things like that in the workplace. So you want to also include your reference page and whatever references that you use. It's very important to cite those, and I've tried to make that as clear as possible throughout the first part of this class, that you want to at least attempt to cite work, even if you don't do it entirely correct or by the book, so to speak. The whole idea is that you are giving the proper credit that is due to the person who came up with the work, or the original owner, so to speak. So with all that being said, again, please contact me with questions about APA format, or if you are having difficulty understanding how this procedure works. There are resources available at the university, at the Writing Center, and I'm sure the English department also has some resources that may be able to help you. However, they are more on the humanities side of the house, and typically they will be writing more in MLA format at your level of writing. Again, so just a brief guide to help you in your research and your writing. Contact me with any more questions regarding all that. And with that said, we'll get into some of the things that we need to talk about the first couple of chapters in the book. Now, as some of you have been reading throughout the different chapters, you can see a little bit about how the book is structured and how things are said and done in the book. And the textbook is great. It's a valuable resource. I want you to use that resource, but I don't want you to think that that's the ultimate sort of end point or the end result is what the book says. Because when you get into practical application in the field and when you're actively involved in any type of, whether it be a public policy agenda or anything that has to do with the state or the federal government, you will understand that things don't really work out the way the book says they do a lot of times. So just keep that in mind. And remember, I'm going to bring these lectures to you in the form of sort of power lectures because I'm going to just push through the material. My hope and the reason for this is that you should have read through the textbook already and have a good basic understanding. So I'm going to really sail through this material and do that in a very brief fashion. I'm not going to spend a lot of time elaborating on the concepts and things of that nature because we do that in the discussions and we do that in the forum within the classroom. That is your time to discuss things and the main ideas and concepts that are important to you. So our learning outcomes, the terms that you learned are very basic, things that you've seen before, different types of democracy and rule from one end of the spectrum to the other. We talked about conflict a little bit and ideology, and also the changing American population and social trends. So our slides, again, they're very brief and they give you a good quick snapshot of the information found in the textbook. Government, it says government is everywhere. That's a subjective statement. It is involved in a lot of areas of life, but everywhere is kind of a push to say, in my opinion. But you do have things like a birth certificate and a death certificate and things that are recorded throughout your life. The basic things in terms of why is it necessary to promote order? This goes back a long way that you learned in the textbook. Liberty and tyranny are the two paradigms that you have when you are thinking about the federal government or any type of government for that matter. And you begin to see sort of a picture that's painted between authority and legitimacy in how things operate within the government. There's a few different things, and a good thing about the book in the new edition of the textbook is it does bring us up with current events. And the picture that you see in the book is a horrific scene that occurred when members of ISIS blew themselves up in the middle of rush hour traffic in Syria. And unfortunately, this is a lot of conflict is going on in the Middle East right now, and it's unresolved, and there's not really a clear direction on what's going to happen in terms of American foreign policy and what can be done, if anything. The different types of government that you talked about in the book: totalitarian regimes, authoritarianism, and democracy. We'll talk a little bit more about those different forms. Direct democracy actually came from the Greeks. They would put rocks into big baskets to cast their ballots, and that's how the public actively participated in the lawmaking procedure. Direct democracy also nowadays has legislatures, initiatives, referendums, and recalls as well. So mob rule was the big thing everybody was scared about because we wanted people that knew what they were doing in power. And it's a sort of an aristocratic way of thinking. You want smart people in power, and to get the others who may not have higher levels of intellect involved would only cause a deterioration in the living conditions and the lawmaking procedure and the way of life. Democratic Republic, you've heard that word a lot. That's what was used in Chapter 1. Throughout the chapter was a reverberating theme of the Democratic Republic, which a lot of you may realize is in fact an oxymoron, because a democracy and a republic are basically polar opposites in a lot of ways. And you can see some elements contained here: republic, popular sovereignty, democratic republic, and representative democracy. At the heart of American government is the Congress, which contains the House of Representatives and the Senate. And we'll talk more about that later. Basically, the whole idea was to split it up, make one house more powerful than the other, and to give at least the appearance or the illusion that all sides are being represented fairly and equally. Principles of democratic government: universal suffrage, majority rule. Okay, so majority rule, a lot of examples we'll see in the book when we get to elections. Sometimes it may be 50%, sometimes it may be, over 50, and sometimes it may be 2/3, depending on what the issue, and especially when you're trying to reverse anything in the lawmaking process, most of the time you have to have an over 2/3 majority to do that. Constitutional democracy is defined, in the Constitution. The principle is limited government, limited interference in the government. So again, there's some more artwork in the book. You can take a look at that. What kind of democracy do we have? Democracy for everyone. Well, that's known as majoritarianism, democracy for the few. Elite theory, also known as aristocratic rule, and democracy for the groups, known as pluralism. In other words, interest groups and any type of group that is sort of trying to advance a political agenda as well. Political culture and political socialization. Some of the main concepts behind the fundamental values section here: liberty versus order. I will go back to the left versus right thing, so to speak. Civil liberties and Bill of Rights. We'll talk more about left versus right and discuss that as we go along more in the book. Basically, we trade our liberty for order, or for protection, really. And there's a whole lot of theological debate and even rhetoric out there that you probably hear on the major news networks that sort of play on those types of attitudes and those types of feelings toward fundamental values in American government. And that's really how they sell their agenda, these major news networks. So, equality versus liberty, two things to take into account there. And again, you can put those on a spectrum as well. To have full equality may not always equate to everyone having the same liberties and vice versa, especially when it comes to things such as economic equality and also people that want to have ownership rights and property rights and the uh, liberty of running their businesses independent from major government interference. So those are some things that you can also take into account as well. The 1965 Voting Rights Act, very important piece of legislation in civil rights history in this country. And there is a famous picture in the book of African Americans lining up outside of a shack in Alabama to vote. So we'll talk more about civil rights and liberties as we go throughout the chapters. And the newer issues, especially nowadays, is the idea of gay marriage as a constitutional right. And for the most part, that's been left up to the states to decide, even though there has been an ultimate ruling in the Supreme Court that says which ultimately made it a fundamental right for same-sex couples to marry according to the Due Process Clause and Equal Protection Clause in the Constitution, which is, I believe, in the 14th Amendment. So that was the famous landmark decision, Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, that you all probably remember seeing on the news. So what this boils down to is, how big should the government be? Well, that varies situationally, number one, as a society, and also it varies individually. We all have different opinions and ideas about the size and scope of the federal government and what its limits should be, and what the restrictions should be, and what the powers should be as well. And ultimately, what should be paid for by our tax dollars. Political ideologies, conservatism and liberalism, again, they are intertwined for the most part, but let's just approach it very basically from a chapter 1 point of view and an introduction to these concepts for you as you learn. Modern conservatism generally began in the 80s. A lot of people call it conservatism, those types of things. And along that same time, we had a revival of the religious right in the 80s. So a lot of Christian people were actively participating in voting during those time periods. We also have liberalism. We have modern liberalism and liberal values. Modern liberalism is, something that's difficult to define. Most of it is emphasized on social programs and equality for all, for each individual. Those are just some of the basic core values, and that government should be a mechanism to promote these types of things. So those are some very basic concepts of the two. Traditionally, if you want to look at some more examples here, socialism, libertarianism. Traditionally, that's what those two things were called. We now know that socialism is a very difficult concept to define because there are elements of it in most aspects of the government, even today. So to say that we have a socialist system, I would not say that, but I would say that there's some elements that are socialized. Obviously, of course, any types of federal programs, Medicare, Medicaid, those types of things are socialized. Okay, so I want to just skip ahead and let this be laid out for you. If you look at the spectrum, remember the thing that I talked about earlier, draw it from left to right. You can see how things play out here. Socialism, liberalism, conservatism, and libertarianism. From one end, going from control over all economic activity and economic powers in the socialist environment to libertarianism, where we have almost no regulation over the economy and the private market basically regulates itself, and supply and demand dictate price levels and wages and things of that nature. And in between those two, you have liberalism and conservatism. And like I said, it's a mixed system here in the US that contains both of those elements, liberals and conservatives. And you can see the differences in the ideology there. Liberals promote government action in the economy, and conservatives generally want government action to support capitalism or the free market, so to speak. Okay? So if you look at the grid, there should be one in the book, normally there is, of those four things that are basically broken down into a different way of looking at it. You can call it a spectrum, you can call it a grid. Each section has their own extremes. Now remember, every idea, every concept will have people that take it to the extreme, and those are known as extremists. Any type of group, any type of organization will have those people. And those are generally the people that make the headlines, unfortunately. And they represent a very small group with within a faction that doesn't necessarily represent the entire group or the entire uh, other individuals that may be associated or identified in that group. So, one nation divided. And the book has gotten a little bit more clever with their wording. You know, we saw the effects of the 2016 election for President of the United States, and quite honestly, it was highly predictable. And the reason I say that is that there is a methodology in determining who will be president of the United States. And I don't mean a crystal ball. I mean looking at history and looking at a number of different indicators, such as who is in office, what party is in office, how long has that party been in power, and a number of other different things that can tell you which political party will be next in power. So to say that Donald Trump was going to win the election initially in the primary stages was a long shot. However, to say the Republican was going to win was not that big of a gamble, because if you look at history, any president normally that makes it to 2 terms will be succeeded by a president that is of the opposite party. Okay? And that's just the way it works. Here's a little bit more about that grid I was telling you about and the book is talking about. You know, we go back to the idea of economic equality versus economic liberty. Basically, if you have money, you want to keep money. And if you don't have it, you want it. And there's no other way to say it. People get into these arguments about, how money should be spent and how things should be regulated and tax controls and all these different things. And it is a matter of your background and whether or not you have the capability to have that total economic liberty or you don't. And depending on those things, you'll support either one of these two ideas. And the political center is, a lot of people will come out and say, especially people on the news or, public figures will say they're in the center or it's what's called a centrist. They don't really have one strong feeling or another, but 9 times out of 10, a person has already decided what their thoughts are on an issue, and they've used one of these values here on the ideological grid to determine what that is. Are you a liberal or progressive? Or if you're more inclined to have social order and social structure in terms of laws that regulate things such as the way you look, or are you more of a social liberty person where people should have the freedom to express themselves and look however they would like and whatever makes them happy? So those are just some things to think about there. Uh, Again, we talked about Donald Trump a little bit already. The controversy behind his run, his successful run for president, is a discussion within its own. I will just simply say that it happened, and there's some documentaries out there. I'll provide some examples for you that those of you that want to follow along and see maybe behind the scenes what happened, and it'll give you a better idea of how he won the election. Okay, changing face of America, the end of the population explosion. Basically, fewer people are being born. We are experiencing more and more older people. The population is getting older on average, and for a number of different reasons that we'll talk about later when we talk about economic policy and the economy in this country. Ethnic change in America. Well, basically, all of the groups you see are changing, minority groups, and that's important as well. The book goes into a better discussion of that. Again, we will cover a lot more of this later. This is just an introductory chapter. And ultimately, are we better off? What indicators do we have to show us that? And if you want to look at this graph, you can see basically the population split here, where the majority of African Americans live in the U.S., and mostly they are throughout the South and the East. And that does bring a lot of questions about, do these groups have influence over the ultimate decision in elections, or do they not? And those are some great discussion topics that we will save for a later time. The same thing with the Latino population, sort of more focused in the West, obviously geographically attached to Mexico, those regions there. A lot of good history in terms of the borders. You can see where the border line was in 1836. So a lot of good, again, things to discuss and read throughout the textbook. And keep in mind as you are reading the changing face of the American population And there are a whole bunch of different interesting graphs and things for you to look at and review in terms of population distribution. Now, when we talk about the economy, we can see prime age Americans, if we look at a study, and this study's roughly around 40 years old, or excuse me, covers 40 years, you can see that we've had ups and downs, especially after 2008 when we had the big financial crisis. And the banks collapsed due to faulty, toxic loans. And basically, they were selling derivatives to a market that was unsustainable and giving mortgages to people that could not afford them. Okay, that's a brief discussion on Chapter 1. Remember, I go over the main highlights with you. You should take it upon yourself to read the textbook and discover things that interest you and read more into those things and get the details of those things. Chapter 2 is on the Constitution of the United States. And if there's any chapter that you should be paying attention to, it is this chapter, because you can base a lot of your opinions on topics that we discuss in this book on the U.S. Constitution in terms of what does the Constitution say, or what does it not say, sometimes more importantly. Okay? Your learning outcomes are listed here. We discussed the colonial Americans, the Declaration of Independence, why the Articles of Confederation failed, what happened at the Constitutional Convention, and why people were arguing over the Constitution being adopted, and ultimately why the Bill of Rights was adopted as well, and how the amendment process works and how it's changed over time. And it does take a lot to amend the Constitution. It's a very long and drawn out process. The amendment process, as I said earlier in this lecture, normally takes a 2/3 vote to amend or to rescind any type of a formal order or decree in the Constitution. All right, so we start off during colonial America. Again, this lecture is very brief and concise, so take it upon yourself to look more into the book, The Separatists, the Mayflower, and the Compact. Okay? The Separatists basically thought the Church of England was crooked, or they wanted people to buy their way into heaven and to give to the church so that they could be saved, all those types of things. And again, this is not a religion class or a history class. Those are some things that if you want to look at, I encourage you to do that. But basically, what happened was they came over around 1600, and in 1620, the Mayflower Compact was signed. So the book asks you a very good question. Was it a constitution or not? So that's something for you to think about as well. Could that have been our first constitution? Well, that's up for you to decide. British restrictions on the new colonial America, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act. There were a lot of taxes being withheld on production and goods and services in the newly formed colonies. And what happens is people start to get together and have these meetings, the First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress, and come up with these ideas that they are getting tired of these things. And they want to write their own documents and their own laws and live their own way of life and not be under an oppressive rule of a monarchy or a dictatorship. The Minutemen, you may remember hearing about those in some previous classes or in movies and cinema, things of that nature. They were some of the first militia members of colonial America. And they were largely unorganized. All right, let's skip ahead a little bit. Let's go to the Declaration of Independence. We all have studied this a lot, probably, in some of your earlier classes, especially in high school, civics, and whatnot. It does contain universal truths that, and of course, you remember the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness thing being one of the most famous lines in that. It guarantees the right to life and liberty, and ultimately the power to pursue what it is that you want to do that makes you happy. Notice it says the right to pursue happiness, and it doesn't necessarily guarantee happiness. So we come up with this idea of natural rights and social contracts, which the difference between those two is natural rights are things that are, quote, God-given, and social contracts are things that are, quote, made by man. And one thing in exchange for another, so to speak. And I hope everyone gets a chance to take a look at the Declaration of Independence and learn from that. And, you know, there are a lot of really cool paintings and stuff. There's one in the book that you see here with Ben Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson that depicts them sort of sitting around coming together and trying to come to a resolution. And there's a really excellent book called Plain Honest Men, The Making of the American Constitution, that I would absolutely recommend to anyone who wants to learn more about how the document was written. The book that I'm talking about was written by Richard Beeman, and it's an excellent book that describes the thoughts between the men and the discussions and then the meetings and the debate between federal supremacy versus populist rule or things that we were talking about earlier. But it's an excellent book for anyone who would like to take a read. The Rise of Republicanism. The Republicans come to power. Treaty of Paris basically has its roots in republicanism, and some people will say that's where the I don't know if you could say modern rise of republicanism came from, but the rise of traditional republicanism in terms of, you know, the guys that were a part of it: Adams, Franklin, John J. Jefferson, and Henry Lawrence. They came together and effectively ended the Revolutionary War. So this was a big moment in American history. So the Articles of Confederation, first form of government, very weak, had no powers to tax or no militia, which ultimately failed. Shays' Rebellion and a lot of different events caused the decision makers to try to come up with a better solution. So the confederal government, and you may recognize that that is a root word, sort of like confederacy. A number of different states that are independent of their own and are not under any influence from a large federal system. And these are some of the examples of an independent confederation. So effectively, you have the power to make war, enter into treaties, establish armed forces, and create different things, the postal system, court system. However, you lack the main things that gives the government legitimacy, and that is a strong and powerful military, the power to collect taxes, and the power to spend that tax money on things that governments provide to their citizens. There's also a lack of a monetary system. Alexander Hamilton is notorious for his love of a big system. He was very much a federalist. He wanted government control. He wanted a monarchy. He wanted one person in charge. That's what a monarchy is, sort of like a kingship. So ultimately, we have a constitutional convention. And you see that the delegates are made up of some of society's elite. And that is something that is reverberated throughout history until today. You'll notice the disproportionate amount of wealth in those who rule versus those who are being ruled. The working environment, this actually all took place in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Was very hot and humid at the time. Benjamin Franklin actually lived right down the road from the State House, which is where this all took place in Pennsylvania State House. So, of course, the book talks about factions among the delegates. You can see where this is some of the beginnings of your political factions or political parties and ideology, if you will, in American politics and socialization. For the most part, all of them were strong nationalists, which means that they backed a large system, which you see in your readings was lacking in the Articles of Confederation. So, compromises. Virginia Plan included the idea of a bicameral legislature. We talked about that a little bit already. Bicameral legislature has a larger House of Representatives and a smaller Senate that takes care of different types of proceedings. This was the work of Governor Edmund Randolph of Virginia, who basically said that the lower chamber of the legislature would choose members of the upper chamber. And he also brought up the idea of states' population being a factor, whereas the House of Representatives would have more representatives according to population. The U.S. Senate would have a baseline of members that was elected from that lower house. So you can see that this favored the larger states. Alternatively, the New Jersey plan wanted one state, one vote. Okay. It favored smaller states for the most parts. But we did get the idea of the supremacy doctrine out of this, which ultimately says that the Constitution is the final rule of law in the land. And we'll talk about some more of those landmark Supreme Court decisions later on in federal law and things of that nature. Roger Sherman out of Connecticut proposed a great compromise. Again, we have a bicameral legislature with a lower House of Representatives and an upper chamber known as the Senate. So these people would be elected from the general population, and it would give some of the beginnings of democracy roots, so to speak, in this country. So it basically took that to make things happen and move the Constitution forward. The next thing, continuing on, the book talks about is the 3/5 compromise, and there was a lot of discussion about that as well, because it basically had to deal with slavery. Okay, so the 3/5 rule basically said that the House and the Electoral College would be apportioned in part on the basis of property, specifically property in slaves, and referring to slavery in terms of value, making African Americans essentially 3/5 value when compared to whites. And there's some more discussion on that later. We'll get more into that in the later chapters on civil rights and civil liberties. George Washington was the leader of the Constitutional Convention, and you have to remember, he was a war hero, basically, and had a lot of leadership capabilities. And you can see why he would be chosen for this type of position. The Madisonian model, this is something that's relatively new in this field, or at least a different way of saying it. The checks and balances and the separation of power comes into play here. So we are aiming for a balance in the executive, legislative, and judicial. And this is the beginnings of the system that we have here today, which later evolves. And the complexities we'll hammer out later as the class goes on. Checks and balances, again, here's a good graph that refers to what I'm talking about. You have a Supreme Court that views the law and rules on the law, known as a judiciary, which is the Supreme Court being the ultimate final stop in the court system. You have the Congress that makes the laws and passes legislation, and then you have the president who approves or opposes those laws, and those laws have to be rewritten. We can also have special sessions of Congress, which we've seen with the budget deficit and things of that nature recently. The final document, you see, the discussion in the book was approved by 39 delegates. And the basics to that, the fundamentals, again, back to popular sovereignty as well as Republican government and limited government, checks and balances, remember, separation of powers, and a federal system, which we'll talk about in Chapter 3, that divides powers between the federal and state governments. All right. So we move forward to ratifying the document or approving it. We have a final document now. It is in the approval process. And here you see where the Federalist and the Anti-Federalists come into play. Some of the beginnings of the political parties here in America were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. People who favored a large structure were the Federalists, of course, such as Hamilton. And you had the Anti-Federalists, people who wanted a smaller system, such as Jefferson and later on Andrew Jackson. And there's a famous group of writings known as the Federalist Papers you've probably heard of. Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay were behind these Federalist Papers, and it was more of a propaganda machine for the new Constitution and the new idea of a large federal system. However, Madison's Federalist Paper number 10 was brilliant. If you have a chance to read it, it is sort of you could say a declaration or a warning for factions in the government, and it within the lawmaking process and the problems that come with that. So the leaders of the Anti-Federalist movement, some of which, for example, Patrick Henry was very much opposed to the new document, the new Constitution. And you have to remember that these people were very skeptical of a large government. And they had a reason to be skeptical. They did not want what had happened in Great Britain and England. They did not want that happening again in the United States. So again, the beginnings of a large system versus a small system argument are seen here. And a lot of people ask the question still to this day, do the majority of Americans support the Constitution? And a number of people say yes, a number of people say no. Beard came up with this idea that basically said the Constitution had been written by the wealthy and they wanted to protect their own interests. Other things to point out, the state ratifying conventions, the delegates to the conventions were only selected by a fraction of the total population in the country at that time in history. So when you think about the idea of democracy and everyone getting a fair say in what's happening, that does not necessarily reflect those ideas. Although the book does say that support was probably widespread to rally the country and bring everyone together. Again, not enough evidence. Chapter 3 is on federalism. Federalism is an extension of where we left off at in Chapter 2. We'll talk about some of the benefits, the frameworks of federalism, how it was brought along from the colonial American days until the Civil War, and we'll discuss the different types of federalism and why it exists, and the more recent events in the Supreme Court, and the different types of systems, and a couple examples in your book: a unitary system, confederal system, and a federal system. We talked about a little bit of those. You can see here in the book, shows you a picture of Flint, Michigan, when the water supply was contaminated last year with high levels of lead. How the federal and state governments both had to try to step in and help these people out. How power operates within the government unitary system. The authority comes from the central government to the states. Confederal, such as the Confederate States, each state transfers its power to a central government. And in the federal system, the idea is that the central governments and the states share power. The many benefits of federalism are outlined in the book. Some may say it isn't beneficial at all. However, it is the system that we have in place here today. And it does give the most opportunity for different ways of life here in this country, otherwise known as political subcultures. Arguments against: a lot of people will say, well, the powers of the state government and local governments are not helping the national government's plans, or there's too much inequality, things of that nature. So again, it's a big system, small system approach to looking at politics and to looking at the way power is shared here in this country. The book again gives us some good examples here. There's a picture in the book of a teacher funded by Teach for America. They are a nonprofit 501(c) organization that hires new graduates out of college to go into these low-income schools and teach them. And they are funded by the federal government, and they receive grants from the federal government. So it's one of the many programs that does have some use here in this country. And the constitutional basis for federalism, again, back to the law of the land, is found in the enumerated powers in the basically Article 1, Section 8, which is also known as the next necessary and proper clause. And it is expressly written in the Constitution. And it gives Congress a blank check, basically, to do whatever it is that needs to be done to make things go along or happen or keep happening in some cases, such as avoiding a federal shutdown. Also known as the Elastic Clause, because of the elasticity that's contained and within the powers that are given sort of almost to no limit or to no end. So we move to the state governments. Police powers, you have your state police, things of that nature. You could say the militia, state militia, National Guard, things like that. Prohibited powers, basically anything that's illegal. You can't have a law that overrides the federal government law. So your book has some examples of those. Concurrent powers, where powers are shared and not expressly written in the Constitution, so they are implied, such as taxing. Supremacy Clause. Supremacy Clause is something we discussed a little bit in the last chapter, which gives the Constitution authority over any laws, any state laws that have been created, and it is the ultimate law of the land. Okay, so we think about those things. We can also think about interstate relations. Interstate relations occur
because states have common interests, basically, whether it be industry or commercial, anything of that nature. However, the Constitution does give some sort of guidance to that. Basically, states have access to public records amongst themselves, and citizens of other states are granted the same privileges, as well as when it comes to the justice system, when there are people fleeing justice, that means that they can be captured and ultimately brought back to the original state. The book talks a little bit about the 9/11 Memorial and when it was erected and how it was erected. There were a number of different states involved in that. Of course, the planning and the commercial and the contracting, but primarily it was erected by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey in a joint effort, what's known as an interstate compact, to get that done. A couple of landmark cases that I did want to discuss with you all from the last chapter. McCulloch v. Maryland was a good example of giving supremacy clause and the idea of national banks. So to make a long story short, the court ruled that a state could not tax a national bank. Gibbons versus Ogden, another good example of defining the federal government's power, was Gibbons versus Ogden, and ultimately what happened was Justice Marshall ruled that states had no authority in governing any type of interstate commerce. So two things: Marshall ultimately defined what commerce was in terms of commercial transactions and business dealings, and also that the power to regulate those types of activities was something that was exclusive to the federal government. And there's a picture of Chief Justice John Marshall, a very famous character in the Supreme Court. Okay, so states' rights become an issue again, and again we go back to left and right, authority, liberty, states' rights versus federal government. So that little guy I was telling you about earlier, Andrew Jackson, was the leader of states' rights. He did not like the idea of large banks and corporate governance. And Jackson was also a war hero. So we have the beginnings of a national civil war here in the United States. And there are a number of different reasons why the war happened. Obviously, the freedom of African Americans was a big part of the Civil War, but there were a lot of other economic reasons as well, due to the large exports that the South was doing in terms of agriculture. There was a lot of cotton going out and a lot of textiles that were going out to back to Europe, and the South was making a lot of money, and they were seeing that increasingly that they did not want to be a part of this large system, the new system that we've talked about so far. So, dual federalism. Back to the idea of shared government between the national and the state governments, which requires to each group to coexist. Okay, so Fast forward a little bit, that was the popular model up until the 1930s. We had the New Deal when FDR basically signed a bunch of programs into law that tried to get the economy back going again. And it was what became known, the period that started what will become known today as cooperative federalism. Where both the states and the federal governments come together to try to solve these problems, such as the economic problems you saw in the Great Depression after the stock market collapsed, and the beginnings of a lot of programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, were actually done under the administration of FDR. John Brown was another famous character in history, and he was opposed to slavery. And he led an assault on Harper's Ferry in Virginia. A very famous site if you ever have a chance to go visit. A lot of good history there. And he was executed ultimately for his little raid that he attempted at Harper's Ferry. Child labor was still common in the early 1900s, believe it or not. That is a fact. A little bit more about FDR. He was a nationalist, very strong supporter of a strong national government when trying to fix problems, and ultimately he did do a lot for the country in the Great Depression, and he did, I guess, the best that he could do at the time, given the resources that he had. So cooperative federalism, there's a couple of reasons why states want to go along, because they get grants. Categorical grants specifically are for programs, state or local programs given by the federal government. And block grants are a little less specific, and they are contributable to whatever different category you want to put them under. The book gives you examples of criminal justice or mental health programs. So basically, categorical grants are specific and block grants are general. Here's some examples. The shift toward central government spending. You can see federal government spending on the rise from 1927 to 1940 in that graph there. The rise in federal transfers to state and local governments. What they mean by transfers is a payment. Ultimately, we are on an upward shift from, you can see, especially after around the 2000s, after 2001, and especially 9/11, and ultimately we had the collapse of 2008. So we see more spending by the federal government. Fiscal federalism and state government. Fiscal federalism is how funds are raised either by taxing or borrowing from one level and spent at another level. So that's how that works. There are a lot of intricacies when these policies are written. So in other words, there has a lot of strings attached to it. And what the word fiscal means simply is revenues and expenditures. It can be at a government level or it can be at a private level. That's why you hear the word fiscal year. That has a lot to do with taxes and things of that nature. Federal mandates require states to take action on something. Usually they will not be given additional funding or any other type of resources if they do not follow these mandates. What ultimately happens is we see competition for resources, and again, back to the basis of political science. Political science is a fight for resources. If you go back to the very first part of chapter 1, you learn that politics is a struggle over power and influence within organizations that can ultimately give them privileges, or in some cases not. So there's a lot of competition for states to pass laws and make or create these environments to get these grants and these programs from the federal government. So, the politics of federalism, national authority, is something that's talked about in your book. That's something that's been going on a very long time. We can debate on this, accomplishments in terms of have they been legitimate accomplishments or not. However, I would like to fast forward a little bit to the new federalism, where you have another change of power from the state government, from the federal government to the state and local government, accomplished around the administration of Richard Nixon. So you can see throughout history you have buildups of power from the federal government to the state governments, and then you have what's known as evolution and devolution, where the states start to receive more power from the federal government. So what I want you to do is recognize these themes, and I told you political science is very thematic. So if you go through, you will see trends such as the trends that you see on a business cycle in the business world. That's why it is a science, because it is, for the most part, very predictable discipline. Now, notice I said for the most part. The argument recently was raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. And of course, proponents on both sides of the aisle, if you want to go back to what we were talking about earlier, if you were a property owner or a very wealthy landowner, when the Constitution was written, you would obviously be in support of federalism or sort of a larger government or economic liberty. And if you were not in possession of a lot of resources, you would be someone who supported economic equality. So those people who own the restaurants will probably be against the additional raise. Now, this is generally speaking. This is not one size fits all thing. And the people that are working in the restaurants will probably be the ones that actually want a $15 an hour raise. So, again, a lot of it is situational. Politics is situational, really. No matter whether it's societal or individually, it really depends on one's position currently. Federalism and the Supreme Court. We've noticed that the Supreme Court, a lot of appointees have been Republican, so states' rights have been emphasized. However, the court has sent mixed messages on their rulings and their case decisions as well. And a lot of those came out of the modern examples of healthcare reform and same-sex marriage. Justice Roberts got a lot of grief over the healthcare reform decision, which ultimately said that basically it was the state's option to grow any kind of program. They did not have to grow it. Programs such as Medicaid. However, that the individual mandate was, in fact, something that was constitutional. The other ruling recently was the same-sex marriage ruling. And that case was another landmark case that we discussed earlier. Basically said Obergefell v. Hodges legalized same-sex marriage throughout the entire U.S. So that was the final rule, so to speak, that was administered by the Supreme Court. There is a little bit of discussion about the health care plan under the Affordable Care Act, and a lot of the proponents of that legislation and also the antagonist against it will cite numerous sources for reasons why the plan may or may have not been effective. What we do know is that it did give people the access to coverage that had not previously had that coverage for a number of different reasons. And we also know that it did increase the rate premiums for people that did have coverage. So subsidizing coverage for those that don't have the coverage ultimately has to come from those that do have the coverage or have the means to afford the coverage. And again, there are a lot of arguments on both sides of that, and I won't divulge personally my thoughts on that, but I do have my background and my research is on the Healthcare Act. A lot of it comes from it, and also from actively being in the medical field as well. Okay, that's it. That's all I have for you for Chapter 3. I hope that you've enjoyed this, and those of you that are maybe in the path of Hurricane Irma, I hope that you stay safe. And for those of you recovering from Harvey, please know that my thoughts and prayers are with you. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me directly using email, or you can also contact the Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences. Thank you all.